The night was eerily silent as Jake made his rounds through the cemetery. The moonlight cast long, ghostly shadows over the headstones, and a chill ran down his spine despite the warm summer air. He had worked the night shift as a security guard for months, but tonight felt different, darker. As he walked along the narrow path between the graves, he heard a faint whisper. He stopped and listened, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispering grew louder, seeming to come from all directions. He spun around, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing but darkness and silence. "Is anyone there?" Jake called out, his voice trembling. He shone his flashlight around, but the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing. The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an unsettling silence in their wake. Jake continued his patrol, trying to shake off the unease. He reached the old mausoleum at the edge of the cemetery and checked the lock. It was secure, just as it always was. As he turned to leave, he felt a sudden, icy touch on his shoulder. He whipped around, but there was no one there. His breath caught in his throat as the whispers returned, louder and more urgent than before. Panic surged through him, and he broke into a run, heading back towards the main gate. The whispers followed him, growing more insistent with each step. He reached the gate and fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking. Finally, he managed to unlock it and burst through, slamming it shut behind him. Jake leaned against the gate, trying to catch his breath. The whispers had stopped, but the eerie feeling lingered. He knew he had to finish his shift, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, lurking just beyond the shadows. Jake gathered his courage and re-entered the cemetery, determined to finish his shift. He walked briskly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As he approached the center of the cemetery, the whispers returned, sending chills down his spine. This time, he tried to ignore them, focusing on his duties. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and suddenly the temperature dropped sharply. Jake's breath turned to mist in the cold air. He spun around, expecting to see someone, but the cemetery was empty. His heart pounded as he continued walking, his footsteps echoing eerily. Then, he felt it again, the icy touch. This time, it was on his hand. He yanked it away, his flashlight dropping to the ground. In the dim light, he saw a faint, ghostly handprint on his skin, cold and clammy. Panic gripped him, and he retrieved his flashlight, shining it wildly around. The beam caught movement, a shadow darting between the graves. Jake's throat tightened as he followed the shadow, his heart racing. He rounded a corner and stopped short, his flashlight illuminating a small, ancient headstone. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps as he approached the headstone, compelled by an unseen force. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt to reveal the name engraved on it. His eyes widened in shock. It was his own name, followed by a date, tonight's date. A cold breeze swept through the cemetery, and Jake felt a hand on his shoulder, stronger this time. He jumped up, stumbling back. The whispers returned, louder and more menacing. Fear surged through him as he realized the truth. Something in the cemetery wanted him, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Jake's mind raced as he stood frozen in front of the headstone bearing his name. The cold touch lingered on his shoulder, and he felt an overwhelming urge to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. The whispers intensified, filling his ears with unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from all around him. Summoning all his strength, Jake broke free from the invisible grip and bolted down the path. The shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, moving with unnatural speed. He tried to focus on the exit, but every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the cemetery's maze. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone, using its weak light to navigate. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if a crowd of unseen entities surrounded him. He stumbled upon an old, decrepit chapel at the center of the cemetery. Desperate for safety, he pushed open the creaking door and stepped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the darkness seemed thicker here. He found an old candle and lit it, the small flame casting eerie shadows on the walls. As the whispers quieted, Jake caught his breath and surveyed the chapel. It was filled with dusty pews and an altar covered in cobwebs. A large, cracked mirror hung on the back wall. Drawn to it, he approached cautiously. In the flickering candlelight, he saw movement in the mirror. It wasn't his reflection, but a shadowy figure standing behind him. He spun around, but the chapel was empty. When he looked back at the mirror, the figure was closer, its eyes glowing with an eerie light. Jake backed away, but the figure reached out, its hand extending through the glass. The whispers returned, louder than ever, as the hand gripped his arm, pulling him towards the mirror. Jake's heart raced as the icy hand pulled him toward the mirror. He struggled, trying to break free, but the grip was unnaturally strong. The whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar, filling his mind with fear. He could see the figure's face now, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. Desperate, Jake grabbed a nearby candlestick and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and the figure vanished, releasing its grip on him. He stumbled back, breathing heavily, and looked around the chapel. The whispers had stopped, and an eerie silence filled the air. Just as he thought he was safe, the shards of the broken mirror began to move, rearranging themselves on the floor. They formed words, spelling out a chilling message. "You cannot escape." Jake's fear turned to determination. He wasn't going to let whatever haunted this cemetery claim him. He pushed open the chapel door and stepped into the night, the cold air biting at his skin. The path to the gate seemed clearer now, and he ran, fueled by adrenaline. As he neared the exit, the ground beneath him began to tremble. Gravestones toppled over, and the earth split open, revealing gaping chasms. From these chasms, shadowy figures emerged, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light he had seen in the mirror. Jake's pace quickened, his eyes fixed on the gate. He could see it just ahead, slightly ajar. The shadowy figures reached out for him, their whispers turning into anguished cries. He dodged and weaved, narrowly avoiding their grasp. With one final burst of energy, Jake reached the gate and pushed through, slamming it shut behind him. The cries and whispers faded into the distance, and he collapsed on the ground, exhausted but relieved. He had escaped. For now, Jake lay on the ground, catching his breath, his body trembling from the adrenaline and fear. The silence outside the cemetery was almost deafening compared to the chaos he had just escaped. He knew he had to report what happened, but who would believe him? Gathering his strength, he stood up and looked back at the cemetery gate. It loomed ominously, as if daring him to return. He decided to head home and think about his next steps. As he walked away, he felt the cold touch again, this time on his back, like a warning. At home, Jake tried to rationalize the night's events, but the chilling details were too vivid to dismiss. He researched the cemetery's history, hoping to find some explanation. What he discovered made his blood run cold. Years ago, the cemetery was the site of a mass grave for victims of an unexplained tragedy. The records were incomplete, but there were stories of unmarked graves and restless spirits. The date on the headstone he had seen matched the night of the tragedy, tonight. Jake realized that the spirits were trying to communicate, to warn him. He needed to understand what they wanted, to find peace for himself and them. With renewed determination, he returned to the cemetery the next night, armed with research and a plan. He walked the familiar path, feeling the whispers return, but this time with less malice. He reached the old mausoleum and placed a flower on the ground, a gesture of respect. The air grew still, and the whispers softened, almost grateful. Jake felt the cold touch one last time, but it was gentle. The shadows receded, and the eerie feeling lifted. He had made a connection, brought some peace to the restless spirits. As he left the cemetery for the final time, he knew he had changed something, not just for the spirits, but for himself. Jake continued his job, but with a new understanding and respect for the unknown. The whispers in the dark no longer haunted him. They became a part of his story, a testament to the unseen world that lingered just beyond the shadows. Mark had taken the night shift at Greenfield Cemetery for the extra money, but tonight, something felt off. The moonlight barely penetrated the thick fog that hung over the graveyard, casting an eerie glow on the tombstones. As he walked his usual route, his flashlight beam caught something unusual, a small, overgrown pathway he had never noticed before. Curiosity piqued, Mark decided to investigate. He pushed through the dense foliage, his heart pounding with each step. The path led him to an old, decrepit mausoleum, hidden deep within the cemetery grounds. Its entrance was partially concealed by vines and moss, as if it hadn't been disturbed for decades. Mark hesitated, but a strange compulsion drove him forward. He pushed open the heavy door with a groan, and a cold, musty air greeted him. Inside, the mausoleum was dark and damp, with cobwebs hanging from the ceiling. His flashlight revealed an ornate but ancient design on the walls and floor. As he explored further, Mark's foot struck something solid. He looked down to see a loose stone in the floor. He knelt and pried it up, revealing a narrow, dark passageway leading underground. The air that wafted up was colder and carried a faint, unsettling whisper. Taking a deep breath, Mark descended into the passage, his flashlight flickering. The walls were lined with old, crumbling bricks, and the floor was uneven. The whispers grew louder, echoing around him, but he couldn't make out the words. It felt as if the walls themselves were speaking to him. The passage opened into a small, underground chamber. Mark's flashlight illuminated rows of old, dusty coffins stacked against the walls. In the center of the room was a stone pedestal with an ancient, leather-bound book resting on top. The whispers intensified, and he felt a chill run down his spine. Mark reached out to touch the book, and as his fingers brushed the cover, the whispers stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening, and an overwhelming sense of dread filled the room. He knew he had uncovered something that should have remained hidden. Mark stood frozen, his hand hovering over the ancient book. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides. He took a deep breath and picked up the book, its leather cover cold and rough to the touch. As he opened it, the whispers returned, now echoing louder and more urgent. The pages were filled with strange symbols and writings in a language he couldn't decipher. His flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the chamber, clear and desperate. "Help us." Mark spun around, his heart pounding. The chamber was empty, but the voice persisted, growing louder and more insistent. "Help us," it repeated, echoing off the stone walls. He shone his flashlight around, searching for the source, but there was nothing but the coffins and the shadows. Determined to find answers, Mark flipped through the pages of the book. One page caught his eye, a detailed map of the cemetery with a series of cryptic notes. It pointed to another mausoleum, one he hadn't explored yet. The voice continued to plead, "Help us," sending chills down his spine. He knew he had to follow the map to uncover the secrets hidden within the cemetery. Mark retraced his steps, leaving the underground chamber and emerging into the cold night air. The fog had thickened, and the moonlight barely pierced through it. As he made his way to the indicated mausoleum, the whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. He reached the structure, a large, imposing building that seemed to loom over him. The door was ajar, as if inviting him in. Mark hesitated, but pushed the door open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers grew deafening. He shone his flashlight around, revealing more coffins and a stone altar in the center. On the altar was another book, similar to the one he had found. He approached the altar, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. As he reached for the book, the voice spoke again, clearer than before. "Release us." Mark knew he was close to uncovering the truth, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Mark's fingers hovered over the second book as the whispers reached a fever pitch. He hesitated, the oppressive feeling of being watched making his skin crawl. He took a deep breath and opened the book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Just like the first, it was filled with cryptic symbols and notes. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him, but before he could react, a faint, ghostly glow illuminated the room. He turned to see a translucent figure standing near the altar, its eyes sad and pleading. "Release us," the figure whispered, its voice a haunting echo. Mark's heart raced as he backed away, but the figure remained, its eyes fixed on him. Summoning his courage, he stepped forward and asked, "How?" The figure pointed to the book, then to a large, ornate coffin in the corner of the mausoleum. Mark's hands trembled as he flipped through the book, searching for any clue. He found a page with detailed instructions, written in an ancient script, describing a ritual to free trapped spirits. Determined, he approached the coffin and pushed the heavy lid aside. Inside lay a withered, ancient skeleton, clutching a small, intricately carved box. Mark carefully lifted the box, the whispers growing softer, almost anticipatory. He followed the instructions, arranging candles and chanting the words written in the book. The room grew colder, and the ghostly figure watched intently. As he finished the ritual, a blinding light filled the mausoleum, and the figure began to dissolve. "Thank you," the voice whispered, fading into the light. The whispers ceased, and the mausoleum was silent. Mark knew he had done it. He had released the trapped spirits. But as he left the mausoleum, he couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery still held more secrets. Mark left the mausoleum, his mind racing with the events of the night. The fog had lifted slightly, and the cemetery seemed eerily calm. He knew there was more to uncover, and the cryptic notes in the first book haunted his thoughts. Determined to find answers, he headed back to the hidden passage where it all began. He descended into the underground chamber, the oppressive atmosphere returning. The broken pieces of the first mirror lay scattered on the floor. Mark carefully examined the book again, focusing on the cryptic notes. One symbol stood out, a circle with intersecting lines. It matched an engraving he had seen on a large, ornate headstone earlier that night. Mark retraced his steps to the headstone, the whispers silent, but the tension palpable. He knelt beside it and brushed away the dirt, revealing more symbols in a hidden compartment. With trembling hands, he opened it, finding a small metal key and a rolled-up parchment. The parchment contained a detailed map of the cemetery, marking specific locations with the same circle symbol. Each mark corresponded to a hidden passage or mausoleum. At the center of the map was a symbol he hadn't seen before, a large, intricate design resembling an ancient seal. Mark realized the key might unlock the central mausoleum, the one marked with the unique seal. He followed the map, his heart pounding with anticipation. The central mausoleum was the largest, with a massive, intricately carved door. The key fit perfectly, and with a deep breath, he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a vast chamber filled with ancient relics and artifacts. In the center stood a massive stone altar, covered in symbols and glowing faintly. Mark approached it cautiously, feeling a strange energy emanating from it. As he reached the altar, he saw an inscription on the wall. It was a message, clear and ominous. To disturb the past is to awaken the darkness. Proceed with caution. Mark knew he was on the brink of uncovering a dangerous secret, one that could change everything. Mark stood before the glowing altar, the ominous inscription echoing in his mind. The air grew thick with tension as he realized the gravity of his discovery. He knew he had to proceed carefully, but his curiosity and the need for answers drove him forward. He examined the symbols on the altar, noting how they formed a pattern leading to a central stone. Tentatively, he pressed the stone, and the ground trembled beneath him. The altar shifted, revealing a hidden compartment beneath it. Inside was a small, ornate box, similar to the one he had found earlier. As he reached for the box, the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. The mausoleum's walls seemed to close in, and shadows danced around him. He opened the box, revealing a set of ancient yellowed papers, covered in the same cryptic symbols and a small, glimmering amulet. Suddenly, the shadows coalesced into a dark figure, more solid and menacing than before. It lunged at Mark, who instinctively held up the amulet. The figure recoiled, its form dissolving into mist. The whispers turned into screams of rage, filling the chamber with a cacophony of sound. Realizing the amulet's power, Mark clutched it tightly and began to read the symbols aloud. The chamber shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the altar. The shadows screamed and writhed, unable to withstand the light's intensity. Mark felt himself being lifted, the light enveloping him. When the light faded, he found himself outside the mausoleum, the dawn breaking over the cemetery. The air was clear, the fog gone, and an eerie calm settled over the graveyard. He looked back at the central mausoleum, its door now sealed shut. The whispers were gone, the spirits finally at peace. Mark knew he had uncovered and dispelled a dark secret, but the cost had been great. The cemetery's secrets would remain hidden, and he vowed never to disturb them again. As he walked away, the first rays of sunlight warmed his face. He had survived the night and discovered a story that would haunt him forever, a testament to the graveyard's ancient and mysterious past. Sam had been the night watchman at Silverbrook Cemetery for almost a year, and he prided himself on knowing every inch of the grounds. Tonight, as he made his rounds, he noticed something strange. Near the old oak tree, a grave he had never seen before caught his eye. The headstone was weathered and covered in moss, its inscriptions barely visible. Curiosity piqued, Sam knelt down and cleared away the dirt and moss. The name on the headstone was Emily Thorne, and the date was from the early 1800s. It struck him as odd. He had memorized all the names in the cemetery, and this one was new to him. A chill ran down his spine as he read the epitaph. Restless in life, restless in death. As he stood up, the air around him grew colder. A faint whisper seemed to emanate from the grave, barely audible but unmistakably real. He looked around, but the cemetery was silent and empty. Sam tried to shake off the eerie feeling and continued his patrol, but he couldn't stop thinking about the forgotten grave. Back at the caretaker's shed, he searched the cemetery records, hoping to find some mention of Emily Thorne. To his surprise, there was no record of her burial. It was as if she had been erased from history. Determined to uncover the truth, Sam decided to dig deeper. That night, he returned to the grave with a shovel, intent on discovering what lay beneath. As he dug, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. When his shovel finally struck something solid, he uncovered a small, ornate box buried alongside the coffin. Sam's hands trembled as he opened the box. Inside was a collection of old letters and a locket. The letters were addressed to Emily, filled with tales of love and betrayal. The locket contained a faded photograph of a young woman. As he read the letters, a sense of unease settled over him. Suddenly, a cold wind whipped through the cemetery, and the whispers turned into a mournful wail. Sam felt a presence behind him and turned to see a ghostly figure standing by the grave. The apparition was of a young woman, her eyes filled with sorrow and pain. Sam's heart raced as he faced the ghostly figure. The apparition of Emily Thorne hovered near the grave, her translucent form shimmering in the moonlight. Her sorrowful eyes seemed to plead with him, and the mournful wail filled the night air. Summoning his courage, Sam spoke. "What do you want?" The figure pointed to the letters in his hand, her expression desperate. Understanding that the letters held the key to her story, Sam nodded and began to read them aloud. The letters painted a tragic tale. Emily had been betrayed by her lover, a wealthy man who had promised her the world but abandoned her in the end. Heartbroken and alone, she had died under mysterious circumstances, her spirit restless and seeking closure. As he read, the wind picked up, swirling around him. The whispers grew louder, forming coherent words. "Find him," they urged. Sam realized that Emily's spirit sought justice for her untimely death. Determined to help, he pocketed the letters and the locket, promising to uncover the truth. The next day, Sam visited the local library, poring over old newspapers and records. He discovered that Emily's lover, Thomas Blackwood, had been a prominent figure in the town's history. His sudden disappearance after Emily's death had fueled many rumors, but nothing concrete had ever been found. Sam knew he had to find Thomas' grave, hoping it would provide more answers. He returned to the cemetery that night, the weight of his promise heavy on his shoulders. The atmosphere was tense, and he could feel Emily's presence guiding him. He finally located Thomas's grave, hidden in an overgrown corner of the cemetery. The headstone was elaborate, befitting a man of his stature. As he knelt beside it, the whispers intensified, urging him to dig. Sam began to dig, the ground soft and yielding under his shovel. As he worked, the whispers grew louder, filling his mind with fragments of Emily's sorrow and anger. He finally unearthed a small, rusted chest buried near Thomas Blackwood's grave. His hand shook as he opened it, revealing a collection of personal items: letters, a pocket watch, and a journal. The journal contained Thomas's confessions, detailing his betrayal of Emily. He had promised to marry her, but abandoned her to marry a wealthy heiress, securing his place in high society. Consumed by guilt, Thomas had written about his regret and fear that Emily's spirit would never forgive him. As Sam read the final entry, a cold breeze swept through the cemetery, and a ghostly figure materialized beside Thomas's grave. It was Thomas, his face contorted with remorse and fear. His apparition looked at Sam, then at Emily, who stood silently nearby, her expression a mix of sorrow and resolution. "Forgive me," Thomas's ghostly voice echoed, filled with despair. Emily's figure shimmered, her eyes locking onto his. The air grew tense, the whispers reaching a crescendo as the two spirits confronted each other. Sam watched in awe and fear, feeling the weight of centuries-old emotions. Emily stepped forward, her form becoming more solid. She reached out to Thomas, her touch ethereal yet powerful. "It's time to move on," she whispered, her voice carrying a sense of peace. Thomas's figure began to fade, his face softening as if a burden had been lifted. Emily turned to Sam, her expression grateful. The wind calmed, and the whispers ceased, leaving a profound silence in their wake. Sam knew he had helped bring closure to a tragic chapter of the past. Sam stood in the eerie silence of the cemetery, the ghosts of Emily and Thomas now at peace. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but also a lingering unease. As he gathered the journal and letters, he noticed a faint, glowing inscription on Thomas's headstone that he hadn't seen before. It read, "Those who disturb the past shall face its wrath." A chill ran down his spine. He wondered if he had indeed disturbed something far darker. That night, back in the caretaker's shed, Sam couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with tension, and the once familiar surroundings felt oppressive and foreign. Determined to understand the warning, Sam delved deeper into the cemetery's records. He found references to a series of disappearances in the 1800s, all linked to a mysterious figure who had supposedly cursed the land. The stories spoke of a malevolent spirit seeking vengeance against those who disturbed the dead. As he read, the room grew colder, and the whispers returned, more sinister than before. Sam realized that by uncovering Emily's and Thomas's story, he might have awakened a darker force. He felt a cold breath on his neck and spun around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. His heart pounded as he fumbled for his flashlight, the whispers now a cacophony of anger and warning. The beam of light revealed shadows moving along the walls, creeping closer. Desperate, Sam grabbed the journal and letters, knowing he had to put everything back where he found it. He raced through the cemetery, the shadows following, growing more solid and menacing. The whispers were now screams, urging him to leave. As he read, the room grew colder, and the whispers returned, more sinister than before. Sam realized that by uncovering Emily's and Thomas's story, he might have awakened a darker force. He felt a cold breath on his neck and spun around, but the room was empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. His heart pounded as he fumbled for his flashlight, the whispers now a cacophony of anger and warning. The beam of light revealed shadows moving along the walls, creeping closer. Desperate, Sam grabbed the journal and letters, knowing he had to put everything back where he found it. He raced through the cemetery, the shadows following, growing more solid and menacing. The whispers were now screams, urging him to leave. Desperate, he turned to Emily's grave, the original source of the disturbance. He knelt and placed the locket and the letters he had found back into the ornate box, burying it beside her coffin. As he finished, a blinding light erupted from the graves, and the shadows recoiled, screaming in agony. The light intensified, and Sam shielded his eyes. When it faded, the cemetery was silent and still. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. The shadows were gone, and the whispers had ceased. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. Emily's ghostly figure appeared one last time, her expression serene. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice gentle and grateful. She faded into the night, leaving Sam alone in the quiet cemetery. Sam knew he had restored balance, but the warning on Thomas's grave remained etched in his mind. He had confronted the past and survived, but he understood the gravity of disturbing the resting places of the dead. He walked away from the cemetery, the first light of dawn breaking the horizon. He had faced the echoes of the past and emerged stronger, vowing to respect the secrets that lay beneath the earth.